we're ready to begin. Super. So this next panel is entitled Debt and Future Haunting on Banks, Insurance, and the Unpayable. If you're just joining, I'm Rachel Rakes, Fox Curator of Public Practice, and we'll be moderating this next discussion. The idea for this particular strand in the symposium was more or less initiated from a conversation with artist and no linear fucking time interlocutor, Femke Herregraven, about the origins of Chase Bank in the US, which I learned about through the work of American artist Cameron Rowland. A strand of Rowland's work departs from the fact that what became Chase Bank was initiated initially through trading insurance policies on slaves in the North Atlantic slave trade. These transactions, it might go without saying, still haunt American life today in terrifying ways. Femke, who is a long-term researcher of histories and developments of financial products and transactions, mentioned that in addition to her work on the speed of transaction, on abstractions of capitalism, and their ways of determining the future, she's begun exploring the origins of the Dutch bank ABN-AMRO, which also established itself during the Atlantic slave trade and, of course, is now thriving today. Thinking about the debts these products create and the way they form intergenerational wounds, we asked educator Max Haiven to join this conversation. That's Max. Max's recent work deals with ideas of capitalist sacrifice, indebtedness, and ideologies of financial providence. He also proposes ways of working in common against these interwoven constrictions. And I should also mention that Femke as well has quite a bit of propositional aspects to her work. It's not all doom and gloom. So we'll start. Oh, I also wanted to mention that in Haiven's initial proposition to us, he references the work of scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who I would like to mention took part in our previous exhibition and series of gatherings, Fragments of Repair, Cataratia. Gilmore's talk with Olivier Marbouf on abolition, representations of violence in the carceral state, is available on our YouTube page. In case you'd like to see that, it's great. So we'll start with the presentation by Femke. Herregraven's work focuses on the effects of abstract value systems on the historiography and individual lives affected by capital. She's currently a creator doctor's candidate at Sandberg Institute in Amsterdam, and together with artist John Ketembayi Mukundi, who's also part of the exhibition No Linear Fucking Time, is part of On Trade Off, an artist-led project on energy mythology around lithium. In 2019, she was nominated for the Prix de Rome. Following that will be Max Haiven. Max is a writer and teacher. His most recent books are the forthcoming Palm Oil, The Grease of Empire, Revenge Capitalism in 2020, The Ghosts of Empire, The Demons of Capital, and the Settling of Unpayable Debts, and also Art After Money, Money After Art, Creative Strategies Against Financialization. Haiven is the editor of Vagabonds, a series of short radical books from Pluto Press, and he co-directs the Reimagining Value Action Lab, or RIVAL, a workshop for the radical imagination, social justice, and decolonization. Femke, take it away.
Is this on?
Would you like to
Yes.
stand, or would you like to sit?
No, I would like to sit.
Okay.
I didn't sleep last night. Yes. Yes, so maybe to briefly mention, I've been working for a long time on, let's say, the field of finance in my work. And the notion of time always comes up in very different aspects. Sometimes it's about time, trading time. It was mentioned earlier, high-frequency trading. I did some work on that. So time scales that we cannot experience, that are so incredibly fast or slow that we actually cannot experience them as humans. But what is always very present is this kind of relation of finance with the future and how its claim on the future intervenes with the now, let's say. And so this presentation is a little bit doom and gloom. I just want to share some examples or references of my research, and then hopefully in a conversation it can be a bit more propositional as well. sorry, let me, progressive time and the financialization of human bodies and lives as risk. So risk is something that I've been working on for the last few years. So I would like to talk about this relation between time and risk, financial risk, or what is labeled as financial risk. I guess this is a very deep human sort of tendency to worry about the future, like what lurks in the future. It's very natural to all of us. But problems arise when this anxiety is kind of financialized and labeled as risk and traded as risk. Just as a reference, here's some images of my work here in the exhibition, which is about a specific cat bond that was issued in 2021 that speculates on when a series of volcanoes might erupt in the next years and will destroy, let's say, local communities. But I will get a bit back into this cat bond. In the work, there's also these different time scales present. There's like here petrified wood from this location where this volcano is in Indonesia, of so many million years old. But there's also this real-time live footage of the volcano. So you can have a look at it in the exhibition. But yeah, so the thing to put on the table for this discussion is the distribution of risk and debt. Maybe to mention something that I'm interested in is often we think also of inequality as being caused by capital who has and who has not, but I would also like to think about it in terms of how risk is distributed. So which communities are exposed to a lot of risk, which communities have the ability to protect themselves against risk, or which communities are labeled as risky, and also the distribution of debt. And so this is a relevant work to mention. This is very simple work in a way. It's a double-sided light box. On the one hand, you have on the one side you have an overview that's on for you on the right side. It's called the Table of Casualties from 1662. This is known as one of the first what is called mortality tables that indexed what people died of at that time in the city of London. And this table, I'm interested in it because it's kind of the sort of root of a financial product that is called a cat bond, that is a very complex financial product that speculates on future catastrophes, and within the financial world is referenced to as the high Olympics of finance because they're so incredibly complex to construct using artificial intelligence technologies, predictive structures, and which is embedded in the insurance industry. So on the other side, so for you here on the left side, there is a table of all the cat bonds that were ever issued so far. So it took me quite some years to collect this, but the first cat bonds were issued in the 90s, and this is up until 2018 when I made the work. And basically, it states, a cat bond states, for example, a tornado might happen, a volcano might erupt, it will cause this much damage in this location, so much wounded, that people will be involved, and this is how much we price this damage. And so this is traded on financial markets, and of course, it's, I guess my intention was to just have an image of how do these financial markets envision our future as a catastrophe. So it was a way to create this index. This is some of the other side. Oh wow, there's a nice error there as well. Connected to this work are these 3 light boxes, and this work I made in 2018. And when I was working on this index, I was struck by this one specific cat bond. There was only one in this category, and it covered pandemics. So I made this work about this first cat bond that was issued, pandemic cat bond that was issued in 2017. And I was also struck by this. There is a financial prospectus, so it's a sort of PDF of 378 pages, and in it, it basically is an exercise of how do you calculate how how a pandemic might start, how it spreads, how does it cause destruction everywhere. And you have these kind of tables, like these formulas and ways of how they calculate when this cat bond might be triggered. And to maybe briefly technically explain it very simple, an investor might buy this cat bond from an insurer, let's say, because insurers these days are basically running out of capital to insure the increasing amount of natural disasters. So insurers need capital to pay out claims when a natural disaster happens, pay out the claims to their clients. Sorry, my mind is a bit blurry. So insurers need this capital, investors pay this capital, and then the cat bond has a sort of script of how this natural or man-made disaster should unfold. And when, let's say, a natural disaster or man-made disaster actually does happen and corresponds to the script, the cat bond is triggered. The capital that is in this bond, let's say, is freed up and used to pay out these claims, the insurance claims. If the disaster does not happen, the investor will receive a monthly or yearly fee for it. So as long as the disaster doesn't happen, the investor keeps making money. If the disaster happens, he loses his money. It's a kind of bet. And so that's why in these graphs you also see total confirmed debts. It has to be higher or lower than a certain percentage. And what is also, this is just a word list I collected from this prospectus. It basically shows how our human contact is financialized. So in this prospectus, there's a very detailed description of how human contact, or being close to family, relative, friends, or being in contact with nurses, or touching each other, how intimate contact can all be a financial risk in the light of this cat bond. And so yeah, I think that's something I want to bring to the table, how our human bodies and intimate contacts are kind of part of this whole financial speculation very clearly like this. Then speaking about the body, another example maybe to bring in is this is more like an anecdote, but is this social impact bond that Goldman Sachs created together with the city of New York and Bloomberg Philanthropies, where they were trying to bring down the rate of recidivism from former prisoners of Rikers Island. I think if the number would go down of recidivism, Goldman Sachs would receive money. If not, then sort of nothing would happen. But just to show you how far these financial products already kind of infiltrate our human lives and bodies. Then something I've spoke about with also Rachel quite a lot. This is a different project than here presented in an exhibition, but something I've been working on for quite a long time and relevant for this panel. It's Borski's collateral. I started with this in 2018. And this was I started with this because I was invited by curator Carrie Pilto, who curated an exhibition for this private museum in Amsterdam, Van Loon, an exhibition about financial value. And this particular museum is the former residence of the family Van Loon, who were a very important family in the VOC time of the Netherlands, a trading family, financing family. And when I was invited and going through the archives, this portrait caught my eye. This is the widow Borski. She was the wife of a very, Borski, a very wealthy financer. But she became quite early on a widow, and different from many of the other widows, she decided to continue her husband's, let's say, practice. And she became actually a very known investor herself. At the time, she was considered, and is still considered, to be a kind of feminist because she was in this man's world and she didn't have access to the Dutch stock exchange, but nevertheless she found all these investment opportunities. This is what it looks like on the inside, by the way. So here you see the Queen Maxima in front of her portrait, where she is celebrated, and also as an example of female entrepreneurs. But what was quite interesting about this lady is because she didn't have access to the normal investment projects, she needed to be quite daring and take some, let's say, quite risky challenges on her plate. Also here, yeah, this is from a documentary. I just thought it was nice, a little glimpse. You see here the director of the Dutch Central Bank, and behind him is the portrait of Widow Borsky. But this is a replica where they made her smile a bit more. So just to, as an anecdote. But so what is important, why this lady is important in my research is, let's go through this timeline. In 1788, Thomas Jefferson came to Haarlem to make contact with the Dutch banking world because he was looking for investors. And in the end, Amsterdam investors, via this financing company Hope & Co., that was based in London and in Amsterdam, lent Thomas Jefferson 30 million guilders, used for the Louisiana Purchase, so to buy the Louisiana territory from Napoleon. And then 30 years later, again, U.S., let's say, U.S. leaders, which was not the U.S. yet, obviously, but came to Amsterdam bankers to basically collect investment capital for a second time. And together, the Widow Borsky with Hope & Co., they collected $20.7 US from investors in Amsterdam, Netherlands, but also in Europe, and sent it to Louisiana. And with that, the Louisiana Citizen Bank was established. And this bank is relevant for our story. Here you see some of these bonds, by the way. Is important because the Louisiana Citizen Bank became the bank that created mortgages for plantation owners in Louisiana. So basically, Louisiana Citizen Bank became a plantation bank, financing all these new plantations. These are pages from the Hope & Co. Office here in Amsterdam, from the City Archive. Oh no, sorry, from the City Archive in Amsterdam. And this is just one of the many pages, but what is interesting, these are, on the left side you see, let's say, what they call the parish, so the areas, and then the investments. Oh wow, it's really quite errors, but sorry for that, I don't know, it's a bit messed up, but what you can see is that in the books, all the parishes, so let's say the land, the areas, connect one-on-one with this map of the plantations and their names. So you can see very directly how Amsterdam investors, European investors, were actually creating, the financial groundwork for these plantations to be set up. What happened, and this is the crucial thing again to connect it back to the body, is that these plantation owners needed some collateral in Dutch onderpand for when they would default on their mortgages. And they did so by having the enslaved people on the plantations written up in their books as the collateral. The Louisiana Citizen Bank eventually became J.P. Morgan Chase, and Hope & Co. eventually became, via a long route, the ABN-AMRO Bank. And so what you can see in the books of the Louisiana Citizen Bank is that there were around 13,000 enslaved people listed as collateral. And of course, when a plantation owner defaulted, these enslaved people they became owner of these enslaved people. And it is interesting that somewhere in 2005, Chase Morgan, that's the full name. They were basically sued by a researcher around this, and they created a kind of campaign and a website that said, "We apologize." And this website was up only for a very short time, but on that website they listed, or they published a list with all the plantations and the enslaved people that were part of their financial books at one point that they owned. And so this list disappeared everywhere, but after some digging I found this list back, and this is the first page of it, attachment 2. That's what all these people are reduced to, and this is just one of the pages. So you see who owns the plantation. Sometimes you see here a name of Edward, of one of the enslaved people, sometimes unknown, but there's also plantations with many of them. Yeah, so it's interesting that on the one hand they produced this kind of research and evidence and then took it offline and it disappeared from all sources. Okay, so just briefly, how much time I have? It's okay. So yeah, I'm working on a film project where basically I'm comparing the Louisiana, the area and the plantations to an area called Elswoud, which is just outside of Haarlem. And this place here on the historical map is the old family retreat of the Familie van Loon and Widow Borski, where she would retreat when she was taking a break from her business. And so in the film, I'm trying to connect these two territories and the exchange they had in terms of value and the connection to these empires. And yeah, I'm just going through this a bit quickly. And then to round up, my last slide. Something maybe to mention as well is a structure called the tontine. This was a small financial sort of scheme that was the first one that we know of, was in the 1600s in Amersfoort in the Netherlands. And this is maybe also something to say, you know, financial innovation is backed up by empire, or empire moves forward by this financial innovation. So it's no surprise that a lot of these financial products also have sometimes their origin in the Netherlands. So this tontine, it was basically a kind of how do you say, debt structure? Yeah, I don't know the English word. Yeah, basically, let me explain it a bit in detail. You would have a group of people, and you would each put money in a sort of central pot, we say, and then you would speculate basically on when the others would die. So the person who would survive everyone else would get the pot of money. And this seemed like a good idea, but of course it was obviously very quickly corrupted by murders or members signing up their grandchild as the one surviving all the other members, obviously. And so it became a very sort of vicious scheme to speculate on each other's death. And I think it very much characterizes, of course, the fact that it, you know, is part of this, the Netherlands, the Western kind of, it's rooted in that. At the same time, the tontine also had a kind of parallel life in West Africa, but also in Haiti, where it became a kind of microstructure for, let's say, financing. So often this tontine was formed by a group of women, often street food sellers or women who did handcraft. They would use it as saving money, putting money in the pot, and then if someone had to go to the doctor or something broke in the house, they would lend this person of the group the money so she could use that money. And so it has a very different, let's say, approach to how we deal with risk and how risk can be carried as a group rather than being exploited as a competitive element between individuals. Yeah, so this is a bit of an open sort of series of examples, but Max is very good in reflecting on all these things in the more broader sense. But yeah,
remote. Okay, thanks so much. Thank you, Femke, for the presentation, and for the invitation, and for your attention, everyone. I'm going to speak a little bit about financialization, about ghosts, and about time today. And I wanted to begin with this slide to show a couple of sort of props from the financial industry, which I'll define for you in a minute, throughout history. On the kind of the background picture is a coffee house in London. And at that time, the trading of stocks would take place through the length of a candle. So you'd actually buy a candle from the person in white on the left, and that would be the kind of major sort of marker of time. This would be the sort of place where stocks and colonial ventures, such as we've heard about, would be exchanged. So even before sort of the advent of rigorous clock time, the financial services industry in some ways had a vested interest in defining the linearity of time. On the bottom left-hand corner, you have a clock from the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, or the Chicago Board of Trade, which features on the left-hand side a figure representing Babylon and the Eurasian product of wheat, and on the right side a stylized indigenous American figure bearing corn. The Chicago Board of Trade was the kind of main clearinghouse for financing the expansion of America westward in the settler colonial project. And then in the top left-hand corner, you have the quintessential technology of modern finance, the Bloomberg terminal. If you were to talk to almost any financier, trader, they would have some version of this proprietary software-hardware combination on their desk. And the thing I simply want to draw attention to is the way, how important time is to most of the measurements, notably the graphs, the line graphs that show change over time, as well as the kind of stock tickers, which show the movement of time as indexed by the change in stock prices. The Bloomberg terminal is sort of the dashboard of modern finance in some ways. And I wanted to begin there to sort of introduce us to the idea that the financial services sector, which has these days become sort of the preeminent sector of global capitalism, perhaps along with tech, has always been at the forefront of a certain kind of relationship to the what I'll call white capitalist time, as a summary for the kind of bad, terrible forms of capitalist time and white supremacist time that we're talking about. We'll just call it white capitalist time for now. Finance has always been at the edge of, in some ways, speculating on that time, extending that form of time, and then also enforcing that form of time around the world. Now, I'll describe that through sort of three examples in this presentation. But for now, I just want to point out that what I'm talking about is finance, and the financial sector is often in the formal literature described as the so-called like FIRE sector. And it's an acronym for finance, which is like investment banks, stock exchanges, joint stock corporations. So that's F for finance. The insurance sector, which Femke talked about quite a bit, which sort of borders the kind of vanilla types of insurance that we all might get on our homes or cars, but also extends to these kind of weird arcana of like catastrophe bonds, or reinsurance companies, the people who insure the insurers, and et cetera. And then RE, at the last part of FIRE, is real estate, the real estate sector, which, you know, for anyone who tries to live in a city, or increasingly the countryside around the world, you have direct involvement with, as the forces of gentrification and property speculation basically make us all very close to homelessness. And financialization is a term that we use to describe a couple of things. So on the one hand, it describes this kind of secular tendency within capitalism and capitalist history, which is that at many different moments throughout the history of capitalism over the last 500 years, the financial sector has risen to preeminence, where it comes to control the rest of the economy in various ways. And often this takes place in sort of the 20 or 30 years that immediately precede a massive catastrophic crisis. Because essentially capitalism pivots from exploiting workers and extracting resources to produce useful stuff to sell, and towards speculative gains, which doesn't mean the violence of exploitation or the violence of extraction or the violence of colonialism on which capitalism depends ends. It simply means that the fulcrum of power within the capitalist economy shifts to the financial sector. Now, that's happened many times throughout financial history and capitalist history, but financialization has also come to refer to the period over the last, say, 30 years or so, since roughly the 1980s, 1990s, which we're living through right now, where we've seen massive gains and incredible power of the FIRE sector over practically all aspects of life, so that now the financial services sector basically calls the tune of even other sectors of the capitalist economy. It's increasingly determining what crops get grown and how foodstuffs will move around the world. It determines what's going to be manufactured. It determines where resources are going to be extracted, what populations are going to be rendered disposable. All of that's happening essentially in the financial apparatuses headquartered in the world's sort of preeminent financial capitals, including Amsterdam, London, Frankfurt, New York, etc. So I've been working with a series of colleagues over the last few years to try and complicate the picture that scholars and others have of this phenomenon we're calling financialization, to speak about the fact that we need to account for the power and the continued influence of colonialism and its race-making projects. This has been an intervention I've worked on with Paul Gilbert, Clea Bourne, and John Montgomery. Some of the ideas that the financial apparatus would be entangled with the histories of colonialism and race-making would not be unfamiliar or raise eyebrows among artists, among the people studying the humanities. But increasingly, it's been difficult to convince people working in the social sciences that this is in fact the case, because it's very hard to quantify. You can say, for instance, to go back to Femke's example, that Chase Manhattan Bank literally evolved out of a bank that profited from the insurance and reinsurance of slaveholders. But it's difficult to say where that money went, practically, because money is fundamentally and quintessentially fungible in a capitalist society. So once it enters back into the stream, it's a little bit difficult to say, well, this money has blood on it and this money doesn't. The secret of the story is all money has blood on it. As David McNally points out, blood and money are equated in capitalism in fundamental and not metaphorical ways. Whereas McNally uses this terminology of blood, we're interested in using the terminology of ghosts and haunting and hauntology, which would be familiar to many of you from the work of people like Avery Gordon, Mark Fisher, Jacques Derrida, and Toni Morrison, and those who've interpreted Toni Morrison's work, particularly her phenomenal, really world historical novel, Beloved. And we've been attracted to the notion of ghosts and hauntology for a few reasons. The first is to go to Mark Fisher's definition of the term. The idea of a ghost, so a ghost is not supposed to exist within the capitalist cosmology, within white time, white capitalist time, right? We're not supposed to believe in ghosts, which is ironic because in fact most civilizations around the world do believe in ghosts. They do recognize that ancestors have a presence and a role to play in our lives. That should be obvious to all of us, and it's obvious to any of us who've ever lost a loved one, which is to say everyone. However, within the dominant capitalist cosmology and the dominant white cosmology, ghosts are not supposed to exist. So by bringing ghosts into dialogue with, or making them a guest of, the discussion around finance, and ghost and guest are etymologically connected, we begin to open up something different. The first is that what Mark Fisher calls the agency of the virtual. So ghost describes the way that things that are not material still have material effects in the world. And a ghost somehow recognizes, the term ghost holds a space within the discourse that we all inhabit for this idea that these non-material forces can have material power, which of course not comes as any surprise to those of you in the room who are artists, as most artists are interested in how virtual things can have power over material reality. The second thing that the terminology of the ghost does for us is to allow us to think about the revenant, which is another word for ghost, which is the way that history or the past comes to live again in the present, comes to wake again in the present. The term revenant has connotations of waking. So there's a constant process of something waking up underneath when we bring the ghost into dialogue with finance and financialization. And of course, there's a long history within the capitalist cosmology, even though the ghost is officially forbidden from entering into those discourses. There's a long history of recognizing that when the ghost appears, it comes to claim an unpaid debt, a debt that can't be spoken, a debt that is owed but hasn't been fulfilled. So all three of these reasons give us a lot of encouragement to talk about what we call finance, capital, and the ghosts of empire. And on the left, you have a poster that we organized, I think in 2017 or 2018, Colonial Debts, Extractive Nostalgias, Imperial Insolvencies. That, through another conference, eventually led to this book, which will come out later this year, called The Entangled Legacies of Empire, Race, Finance, and Inequality, and also a special issue of the Journal of Cultural Economy, both of which aim to make quite a, hopefully, seismic intervention in this thing we're calling critical finance studies, to say that, in fact, we have to attend to these ghosts. It's not enough to just sort of do the political economic work of saying, you know, following the dollars and cents. We also have to account for these ontological dimensions. So I want to draw on some other work that I've done over the last couple of years to give you a couple of examples of the way that finance is haunted and haunts us in a certain sense, and the way that that haunting transpires through a certain way of configuring white capitalist time. Recently, I've begun to work with Xenia Benevolsky and Graham Webb on a project where we are talking to rank-and-file Amazon workers about how they imagine the future. Amazon is a massive future-making and future-killing machine. It's one of the world's largest employers. It's one of the most aggressive patenters in the world. And it's, of course, one of the world's leading financial corporations, one of the most profitable corporations in the world as well. And there's a bunch of really amazing researchers who are trying to figure out how Amazon envisions the future. And Amazon was sort of created by Jeff Bezos, inspired by a science fiction vision of a different world, which also led him to invest in his own private space program. And yet that future that that company is building is being built on the backs of its workers. So our question is, what do the workers think should happen in the future? And so we do science fiction reading groups and writing groups with these rank-and-file workers. But that's not, I want to introduce that project briefly to go back to maybe some of the things we heard yesterday about this possibility of a radical bottom-up future making, and we could return to it in a few minutes. The broader point I want to make about it, though, is to ask a somewhat different question, which is, if we just look at the share price of Amazon, which is represented by the line graph here, where is the value in that line graph coming from? Now, within the dominant capitalist cosmology and its sort of official theocracy of neoclassical economics, it simply comes from marginal utility. Someone wants the stock, and therefore it has value. But there's another lineage of thinking about value which comes from the Marxist tradition, which I think is much more useful in our thinking about time here. For Marx, the value of anything in a capitalist society comes from the theft of time. It comes from the theft of time of workers. So consider, for instance, why someone would value the stock in Amazon. Yes, on one level, it's because you might buy it today for $100 and sell it tomorrow for $120, pocketing a $20 profit. But what's really underneath that? There is a fundamental belief on some level that it has to do with the way that Amazon, this artificial entity, this artificial animal, this artificial intelligence, if you will, that's called a transnational corporation, is going to, in the future, be able to harness tiny fragments of millions of people's time. So think about ordering, I don't know, a USB cable on Amazon, right? What's happening in that transaction is you're actually commanding, through your use of money, potentially thousands of people's fragments of their time, from the people who dug the raw materials, to the people who assembled the raw materials in a factory, to the people who built the factory, to all of the people who worked in the transportation grid to bring all of those materials to the factory, to the people who designed the USB cord, to the people who marketed the USB cord, to the people who brought the USB cord from the factory to the store, to the person working at the store, to on and on and on and on. Any commodity under capitalism can be read from within this kind of Marxist lens as a kind of compound representation of millions of moments of stolen time. And further, not just the commodity can be read that way, but the corporation itself, which is made up through the sale of commodities, can be read this way. So if you imagine not just the USB cord, but all of the different commodities that Amazon sells as being represented somehow by the share price in Amazon. All of that stolen time gets distilled into one single number. You begin to get a sense, I think, here of the way that, again, there's this ontological trace. It's in any commodity, this trace of stolen labor, including our own stolen labor in some senses, because our own stolen labor goes into remunerating us with a wage with which we buy the USB cord, right? There's a whole world, a whole universe of stolen labor, of stolen time, that is compounded within the commodity and compounded within the corporation and compounded within financial instruments as well. There's a kind of prismatic dimensionality to it. a kind of a density of ghosts, of fragmented ghosts that can be distilled if we read the commodity and the corporation in a certain sort of way. The second way in which I want to think about ontology and time and financialization is through this construction of, we'll talk, I think, a little bit maybe in the Q&A about Denise Ferreira da Silva's notion of unpayable debts. And I'm thinking here about the way that colonialism, and let's call it again white capitalist time, constructs certain populations as fundamentally belated, as perpetually unable to catch up with modernity. And the irony of this on many, many levels. So the example that I have here is on the left, you can see that this is the Royal Bank of Canada. It's my bank, it's the largest bank in Canada. This is their advertisement for financial literacy for Indigenous people. So out of the goodness of their heart and corporate benevolence, Royal Bank of Canada has agreed to, in the interests of the spirit of reconciliation, as they point out on the website, for the horrible crime of residential schools where Indigenous children were stolen from their families and put in essentially torture chambers to destroy their culture and assimilate them or kill them. They have determined that their responsibility towards Indigenous people in Canada is to offer various forms of help managing money. This follows on a number of years in which the right wing in Canada, as well as sort of the mainstream economists, have suggested that the reason why Indigenous people in Canada suffer much lower health and livelihood indicators, the reason why the majority of Indigenous people in Canada live in poverty, is not because of the enduring legacies of settler colonialism and the continued theft of their land. It is, in fact, because they lack financial skills. And therefore, they need to be educated, better educated. Now, if this reminds you of the same colonial logic that led to the residential schools in the first place, the idea that Indigenous people needed to be educated to fit into a white supremacist culture, you would be forgiven for recognizing that parallel. RBC perhaps shouldn't be forgiven for it, especially given that RBC is also, as this sign indicates, one of the leading funders of new extractive and logistical programs within the territories we currently call Canada to extract resources from Indigenous lands to ship them to international markets. At great profit. The Canadian banks and Royal Bank in particular has made incredible financial profits over the last decades, largely thanks to neoliberal deregulation, as well as just old-fashioned corruption. This sign that you see was actually placed at the home of a executive of the Royal Bank of Canada as in protest, in solidarity with Indigenous land defenders who are protesting against pipelines. What I think this parallel here allows us to see in a moment is that, in a certain sense, from a financialized perspective, within the very limited view of finance, Indigenous people simply need to be included within a white supremacist financial culture, right? The barrier, the way that the poverty and systemic oppression is reconceptualized within the framework of financialized white capitalist time is that this population is fundamentally late. And they need to be brought up to speed. They need to enter into the future with everyone else. But the reality is that underneath this idea is a kind of unpayable debt for the land itself. On the one hand, you have the idea that Indigenous people owe an unpayable debt for their own civilization, right? Within the racist colonial worldview, Indigenous people were not supposed to survive. They were not supposed to exist. And so now their existence is credited to the settler colonial state and its corporations. And these Indigenous subjects are said to owe a kind of unpayable debt for their own survival within the system. An unpayable debt because they were never expected to be able to become modern subjects. And in fact, their inability to become modern subjects within the eyes of finance and the state is an indication that the debt is in fact unpayable. So on the one hand, we have this notion of unpayable debt, which I call unpayable debt from above. We also have what I would call an unpayable debt from below, which is that this whole framework of thinking about financial inclusion in this sense is built on a superstructure of financial exploitation, which depends on the settler colonial access to land and the dispossession of people from land and the elimination of Indigenous presence from land. So the third example is probably familiar to all of you in a certain sense, which is, and I think we got to it with our last panel too, which is that all of us now have become, in a certain sense, financialized subjects. We've been all instructed over the last 30 years of the kind of neoliberal project to reinterpret ourselves not as citizens, as difficult and as problematic as the notion of the nation state and its traditional frameworks of citizenship are, and not even to understand ourselves primarily as consumers or workers, but to understand that each of us should embrace the disposition of the financier in our own lives. And here we can take sort of three, perhaps, examples. One of them is sort of the student, right? The quintessential student, who's been recast from a young member of society who is going to be offered the tools to enter into a sort of commonwealth, and recast as a quote-unquote investor in their future. And here I found this amazing graphic on the left, which is just a generic invest in yourself advertisement for company name. It's put up by an advertising firm that's trying to suggest that it can create advertisements for universities. But it looks generically like every other university advertisement that encourages people to invest in themselves. On the right, we even have a sort of graphic that was used, I believe, in The Economist to advertise social impact investing and microfinance loans, which target the world's poorest people, to replace forms of state-led development which have been declared a failure in the global south. There's now a whole proliferation of schemes whereby investors and states and international organizations begin to approach individuals within the global south and poor individuals as investors and try to offer small microfinance loans to try and kickstart the entrepreneurial spirit. Once again, displacing a recognition that in fact the reason why some people are poor around the world is because some other people and populations are rich. And instead pointing towards the fact that if only we can democratize, so-called, or pluralize, or make more inclusive the realm of finance, everyone would benefit. Again, bound up here is a notion of that everyone needs to be brought up to speed with this chronotope, or chronotope, I should say, of sort of white capitalist time. All right. To conclude, and I'll try and do this briefly, I see this chronotope of white capitalist time as embedded within and feeding into the cosmology of white supremacist, heteronormative global capitalism. And I believe that system needs to be abolished, and I believe we need to have a revolution to abolish it. I don't know what that revolution will look like. I don't think it's going to look like any revolution we've had before. It certainly needs to be global, but I do believe we need a revolution. So I want to put my cards on the table about what I believe. I believe that revolution includes, and is including right now, the dismantlement not only of the systems and structures of that apparatus, it's also including the collapse of that apparatus's cosmology. And I believe the temporality of late capitalism that we live in, white supremacist capitalism, this thing I've been calling white capitalist time, I believe that needs to be dismantled along with an entire thought world that includes, for instance, the way in which the world is spatialized, the way in which the world is measured, the way in which subjectivity is formed. A whole massive form of grassroots revolution is, I think, what we're speaking about, which echoes some of the abolitionist imaginary that's presented by Ruth Wilson Gilmore and others as a total transformation of our world. Now, the point I want to end on is, I think whether you agree with me that we need that kind of revolution or not, I think what's actually happening is that that cosmology of capitalism is actually collapsing. It's collapsing from the inside out and from the outside in. I think we're living through a moment where people no longer believe in the fundamental myths and practices of capitalism. I think we're living in a moment where people are refusing the forms of subjectivity that that was based on. And that's happening both in the global north and the global south. But I'm not sure that's always happening in ways that we should necessarily celebrate. On the first hand, I think as the cosmology and temporalities of capitalism begin to collapse inward on themselves, like a sun turning into a black hole, we are seeing a massive spike in reactionary, vengeful, nostalgic violence. And I think we don't need to look very far to see how that's happening. It happens on a micro level where people take up arms and engage acts in terrorism like we saw in Buffalo last week. It also takes the form of whole states weaponizing themselves to reclaim some sort of fictitious lost tradition, as we're seeing with Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. So the collapse of the capitalist cosmology is by no means peaceful, and it does not necessarily mean it will be replaced by something better, nor does it mean that it will actually eliminate the fundamental structures and systems. It simply means that the belief structures and the cosmology around it might be collapsing. But the second thing that I want to point out, just because I think it's relevant to our discussions here, is that as this system and its cosmology collapses, it gives rise to what Moshe Postone called romantic anti-capitalism. And this is, I think, the big danger and risk for us to think through when we're thinking about about forms of time that resist and reject and rebel against white capitalist time. It's very easy for us to fall prey to a kind of romanticist tendency where we imagine that any form of resistance to white capitalist time is therefore a form of resistance, rebellion, and rejection of the system. Tactically, that may be true. It may be true that creating new temporalities and new ways of working together and new ways of engaging with ourselves and our souls can indeed allow us to break free for a moment from white capitalist time. That might be true tactically, but it's not necessarily true strategically. And here I'm calling up Henri Lefebvre's distinction between these in a radical idiom. Strategically would mean that somehow these forms of rebellion, rejection, refusal accumulate and make solidarity with one another enough that we get to a moment of revolution where we could in fact see the flourishing of those multiple forms of anti-capitalist time, post-capitalist time, post-colonial time that we're dreaming of. And I'm curious how we move from the tactics of refusal to the strategies of reemergence and reinvention.
Maybe a brief minor thing while Max resettles. Femke, you were telling me about how recently ABN-AMRO also similar, maybe in a kind of similar way to what Royal Bank of Canada is doing, has sort of admitted their flaws. And I was wondering if you could just explain that a little bit as a way of starting off in this comparison.
Yeah, I think in April this year, so last month, the ABN-AMRO published that they're in the middle and have done already a lot of research about their slavery past, and that's what they call it in Dutch. And they have published this report of 300 plus pages about it. I haven't read it yet, but I guess it's one of these kind of apologetic things that we've seen with JP Morgan Chase as well. But then the question is, okay, and what's next, you know? Recognizing that and having some internal researchers digging up that history and making all your archive finally public is one thing, but then, that doesn't, it still continues the narrative, the story, what it is as a bank, So yeah, I can't comment too much about that, but that's what kind of happened recently, And
there's a plan or something to kind of make this public, as in so many kind of apologies going around the world with corporations these days.
Yeah, exactly,
I wanted to ask you to briefly clarify also the bond with Goldman Sachs, whether that was around prison recidivism, and like basically a kind of a transaction with with New York State to bring down prison recidivism. Was that thought of as a social, like it was supposed to be a social benefit product or project?
Yeah, it's part of, I think there's around 30 of these kind of what they call social impact bonds that have been set up. And they're kind of ways of this kind of do good idea, like how can we use these financial markets for kind of causes that governments, local municipalities have difficulties with or don't have capital for, like how can we pull in the financial sector to have a new sort of catalyst behind this hopefully improvement. That's a kind of trend, but I think that this social impact bond of the Goldman Sachs, it didn't change the number one bit, so it completely failed,
And I guess, it's sort of, we could think of it as a kind of common sense, why not, right? But I wonder if maybe, Max, you could comment on that common sense, or if it needs to be even elaborated. I don't know. What do you think?
Why didn't it work, or what?
Yeah, how it's foreclosed.
Oh, I think in a lot of cases, the social impact bonds, like that, the social impact bond world or the catastrophe bonds are usually signed between major banks and governments. And essentially the major banks hire the smartest lawyers and people, and then the governments get screwed. Like, it's very rare that the governments actually, and like make their, sort of make a, that it benefits the public in any way. What it does benefit governments is it allows you to, like, kind of kick a can down the road, so to speak. Like, you can be like, oh, rather than actually saving for a catastrophe or preparing our population by, you know, creating a good public health system, for instance, we can just create, like, sign a bond with Goldman Sachs, and then, like, we claim that we're covered and the population's covered. It only becomes due much later, and the costs are much less ultimately. Yeah. So it's sabotaged from the very beginning, I think.
Maybe briefly to also mention this pandemic bond. This was issued by the World Bank, and it was seen as one of the first kind of humanitarian cat bonds, where supposedly the most fragile communities around the world would be protected for the of a pandemic with this bond. But what happened is that in the meantime, when this bond was kind of in the market, you know, Ebola broke out in Congo. There was meningitis in Latin America a number of times. But still the bond wasn't triggered because not enough people died or not in the same location. And so investors kept making money. And so there's also the thing, yeah, you could have also created another fund, a fund where countries, you know, donate money for these emergencies, but rather you pull in these investors and these reinsurance companies, yeah.
And there was not a corona related.
No, and then of course when it was triggered, this was when the West was hit by the pandemic, you know, and that's also interesting that the cat bonds that do stand out in the financial markets that are there, 99% covers disasters in the Western community because, these things are inaccessible because of the high premiums for the rest of the world also, yeah.
Yeah, and it seems to me to represent a larger irony, which is, like, hovering behind here, which is that, like, this is a way in which, like, racial capitalism claims it's going to defend people that it is actively putting at risk. Yeah. Like, there's a really strange irony that, you know, the reason why populations are high risk for most pandemics is simply because 30 years or 40 years of neoliberalism or structural adjustment programs have eviscerated public health programs and made it, you know, and then that's been at the behest of exactly the same financial firms and power apparatuses that are now offering the bonds. There's a parallel too to, you know, the insurance of enslaved people, where, you know, slave owners were insuring people for whom they were the greatest risk. Yeah. I mean, as an enslaved person, the number one risk of death was that you would be either worked to death or killed by the person who owned you and claimed to insure you. And there's some weird, ghostly parallel to that horrific reality.
It's very similar to Femke's last example with the Dutch shared risk system, but more horrible. Maybe, Femke, just to go back a little bit to your work in the show, because it also connects to the previous conversation with Juri and Evelyn, and also is basically a project that stems, even though it's in Java, Indonesia, it stems from the Netherlands and from its colonial past. One thing I wanted to sort of point out about that, and maybe have you unpack a bit, is you had mentioned to me that the surveillance systems developed for this volcanic cat bond are basically they're like basically the best in the world, the highest powered in the world, and they come basically out of the techno time combination that sort of Juri outlined in his talk. And I guess I want to ask you to maybe speak a bit more about how this that sort of development and that advanced development being used by those surveillors, these hedge funds and such, determines sort of how technology goes further and how we sort of not just finance but technology itself sort of furthers.
And you mean in a way like the observation of the...
Yeah, you mentioned that the satellite systems that were used to monitor, I guess not just that volcano, but other, say like for earthquakes and things like that, that the satellite systems that are being used are sort of financed or sort of paid for and developed by the people who stand to, say, make the most in these bonds, on either side of a possible disaster.
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously in monitoring or tracking a sort of potential disaster when it might happen, it involves a lot of complex technology, but also prediction technologies. Of course, also historical data, which came up earlier, the prediction loop. So this is also maybe interesting to mention that a lot of these technologies, also certain satellite tracking systems, they use AI, but it's trained with historical data. So in that sense, the AI is always historical. You have hedge funds that even launch their own kind of small satellites to keep track of certain assets, like they live track gold mines or things like that to kind of already imagine how maybe the gold price might change. But I guess particularly in the case of this volcano in Indonesia, it's one of the it's one of the most active volcanoes in the world, so it's the most monitored one. So let's say the ones investing in these bonds have a stake also in the way how it is monitored and how it is portrayed. Because of course the volcano is also monitored by its local community for centuries, but in a very different way, through rituals. And so there's this notion of observation. Sorry, I lost it. Does that help?
I think so. We can keep going with it. And I can also open it up to questions from the audience. Meanwhile, now that we're talking about prediction and predictability, Max, you were here last night for Walida Imrisha's talk. And of course, what you've been remarking on around sort of anti-romantic kind of future prediction and sort of grand anti-capitalist ideology, as well as your kind of more like these on-the-ground workshops with thinking the future alongside Amazon workers and other workers. I just wondered if you could comment a bit on sort of how you see these kind of radical imaginations or radical futurisms vis-a-vis like visionary fiction, as Walida kind of illustrated it.
Yeah, I mean, Walida's work is so fantastic, and we were really inspired by it in our Amazon project for sure. And not only the theory, but the methodologies that she's developed are really, really important. I think it also is just important to note what wasn't mentioned yesterday is that it really it merges from and comes out of a lot of work on prison abolition. I mean, that was in the subtext behind it, but it really has to do with this notion of abolishing the prison and abolishing police fundamentally. And that I think approach takes its inspiration from the abolition of slavery, which at the time, even 3 years before slavery was abolished, seemed completely impossible. I mean, you had some of the smartest people of the age imagining that, like saying, like, this is never going to happen, and demanding that it would happen is counterproductive. And I think that spirit of abolitionism that says, well, it doesn't matter if you think it's impossible. We created this society. We can recreate it at any time. I think is really, really important. And one of the things that I take from Walida's work really fundamentally, and that can be envisioned through works of creative imagination. And that those works of creative imagination don't need to be done simply by sort of experts and trained officials, but anyone can do it. And somehow some part of our responsibility as those who are trained in works of the imagination or theory is not just to envision a future, but actually to create spaces where other people who are affected by the future making and future killing of racial capitalism get an opportunity to do so. I think that I've taken a lot of inspiration from. My colleague Alex Kasnavish and I worked for a few years also on concepts of radical imagination from a different kind of origin, a different kind of perspective. And that was really our sense too. And I think, as was said last night, like, you need to be able to imagine something in order to demand it, in order to create the change for it. But I think also there's a flip side to that too, which is that you need to begin to practice a life in common and anti-capitalist practices now in order to be able to imagine as well. Like, there's a kind of dialectic relationship between the two, which I think was also in what Walida was saying last night as well.
Do you want to say anything about that, about your own versions of speculative futures that aren't the worst versions, or?
Yeah, no, I when listening to Max, I kind of really support that. At the same time, I have something in my mind like Haiti, you know, which is a nation that is, it's a nation that is basically started by, the enslaved people that became free. But from the beginning, something that Max also mentioned already, they basically were punished for the fact that, you know, France would suffer a lot of financial losses. And so they were confronted with this debt, financial debt that they had to France, which is unpayable. And so, the abolishment of slavery, in a way, offered just new start, but then it also ended in this horror scenario, in a way. So I also was interested in when you said, when white capitalist time might be abolished, but it doesn't necessarily have to be replaced by something better. Yeah. Sorry, this is not so, but But yeah, no, I agree with it. I mean, you know, both the notion of speculation and both the notion of risk, I think, are sort of double-sided, you know. On the one hand, there are things that we research that cause a lot of destruction, but on the other hand, we have to take also risks, and we have to speculate in order to come up with these new imaginaries. So I'm interested in this double-sidedness of risk, let's say, yeah.
I don't understand there's a question, or? From Maria.
Thank you so much. I know we're running out of time, as always, but I have a quick question, Max. It just came to my mind. Of course, Walida yesterday talked about visionary fiction, and it's the term she coined, but in some of her previous publications, she operates the notion of science fiction almost interchangeably with visionary fiction. I suspect there's a radical difference between the two, science fiction and visionary fiction. And I wonder whether you could play with it a little bit. So you probably have a clear opinion on this.
I don't know the distinction that she makes, so I want to preface it by saying that this is a distinction that I'm hallucinating. But I think it has to do with the fact that science fiction as a genre emerges from the racial capitalist thought world. You know, if we look at like the first major figures in that, like H.G. Wells or Jules Verne, these are like huge racists, like just awful racists a lot of the time. And their projections into the future are based on a fundamentally white supremacist worldview, but also a kind of a notion of science that inherits all of the kind of progressive myth-making that we've been sort of critiquing over these last few days. So I can sense that Walida probably wishes us to move away from that legacy of science fiction, also because I think the term science fiction often is off-putting to people who've traditionally been excluded from science, which is to say everyone who's not like a straight white man from Europe. So I think there's been a move, you know, and there's a previous feminist move away, starting in the 1960s and 70s with people like Ursula Le Guin or Margaret Atwood to move us away from science fiction to speculative fiction. And I feel like her move, even from speculative fiction to visionary fiction, indicates a further move away from even the white supremacist tropes of certainly someone like Margaret Atwood, maybe less so Ursula Le Guin. So that would be, and I guess maybe the last thing I would mention is then there's a long history of like prophetic vision and visionariness, that's not a word, but you know what I mean, in the Black radical tradition. And someone like Robin G.G. Kelly whose book Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, was a major inspiration for the Octavius Brood books, really goes into how important that, like, that prophetic tradition is, that merges on the one, that draws on especially West African cosmologies, but other African cosmologies as well, and then articulates them also within or encrypts them within Christian cosmologies when it comes to the Americas as a form of sort of passing. So yeah, I think all of those, I imagine that all of those are probably going through in the influences, but I could be totally wrong. I'd be very curious.
I mean, that's a great version. Okay, and there's one more question from the audience, and then I might try to squeeze in one more in the last 2 minutes, or our past last 2 minutes, but you know.
Yeah, thank you both for your talk. I can't really see you over the TV, but maybe it can be like a social experiment. I actually also had a short comment and a question, and it was also related to this idea of fiction. You mentioned, Max, like this idea of anti-romantic capitalism. I believe that's, yeah, I think we need a retooling of romance. And I think maybe this idea of romance fiction, because it is like one of the widest read forms of like printed matter in the world. And maybe, yeah, I think we need to retool our idea of romance. I also believe that we need a revolution, and yeah, romance has a part to play in that. But my question was actually much more practical. You mentioned unpayable debt from above and unpayable debt from below, and I didn't quite get the difference between the two in terms of indigeneity. So yeah, some clarification would be great.
Sure. I agree with you. And I meant to say that I'm not against romance, and I'm not against romanticism. I'm just against. It's just a warning that when it dances with anti-capitalist ideas, there's risks associated with it. And I just want to give a shout out to Jordi. What's Jordi's last name? The book Confessions of the Fox. I don't know if you've read this, but it's an 18th century trans romance novel about a thief in London, and it's incredible. And if we're talking about anti-capitalist romance, this is like, be still my heart. It's great. Rosenberg, Jordi Rosenberg. Excuse me. Okay. And then unpayable debts from above and below. I'll try and keep this very brief. I tried to play with this terminology. I was inspired by Denise Ferreira da Silva's sort of discussion of unpayable debts, but I sort of worked on this before her book came out and before her idea was completely developed. I would do it differently now, I think, in light of her important discussion of it. But for me, I was trying to understand how the world hangs in a balance between these unpayable debts from above and below. And the unpayable debts from above are debts that we all acknowledge can never be repaid and yet are still enforced. So this would be, for instance, like the debt of Haiti for freeing themselves from slavery that was enforced. Or the debt that's forced on like millions of working class and mostly racialized Americans for having gone to university or having gone to the hospital. You know, it's a debt everyone acknowledges will not be repaid. The financial system acknowledges it can't be repaid, and yet it's still enforced. The debt that's been forced on Greece or on Puerto Rico and many other countries around the world. These are the debts, so these are unpayable debts from above. And then I contrast this to unpayable debts from below, which are debts that are owed but are not acknowledged by the systems of power. So these are the debts like reparations for the transatlantic slave trade, for instance. It is a debt that is owed, it's unpayable in a certain sense, and yet it's not acknowledged or respected. Or the debt of the theft of land in the territories we currently call Canada, or the debt of Europe, or Western Europe especially, for colonialism. And the reason these are unpayable is because, not just because there isn't, because they're kind of unspeakable and unacknowledged. It's also because to pay them in a certain way, there's not enough money in the world, because the whole world and its monetary systems are built on those forms of exploitation. So it's kind of a weird thing to imagine that you would, like, there are real demands that have numbers behind them for compensation for all of these things. But I think the more radical demand is to say, in fact, these debts are unpayable, and to close the debt, to balance the books, so to speak. The system that caused the violence in the first place needs to be abolished now. And I think those are kind of some of the more interesting movements we're seeing around the world, including in Canada, where many Indigenous people are saying, you can't give us enough money for our land. The land is not for sale. You can't quantify it, you can't commodify it. the end. You need to change your system. I think those are the most interesting movements around debt that I'm seeing.
Yeah, just a really quick question to you. I was wondering, you also spoke about the kind of new, I don't know if it's how old it is, but the trend of creating these sort of products for indigenous communities to enter the kind of financial system and debt structures in a way. The same is happening a lot now also around LGBT communities. There's a lot of life insurances for LGBT communities, and for me the question is like, you know, this kind of need to constantly keep expanding and find new kind of ways of involving people in debt structures. It's part of this, but what kind of choice do these communities have? Like, I mean, yeah. No, I mean, since you did the research on the more indigenous communities, I was wondering, what is the...
Do we have enough time, or do we have to leave
Just
it?
make it quick.
Yeah, I think that if you want to participate in the mainstream capitalist economy, there's very few choices. But I think a lot of communities, both LGBTQ communities and indigenous communities, are just finding other ways to provision themselves.
Yeah.
So rather than getting insurance, the question, like, insurance is like, if something bad happens to me in the future, what's going to happen? I think a lot of those communities are creating networks of care and mutual aid that allow them to exit those relations. And have been doing so. I mean, certainly in the LGBTQ community since the AIDS crisis, where, you know, they were, you know, that whole community was not just left to die, but actively encouraged to die by state apparatuses. There's been this kind of development of alternative things. And I think for indigenous communities in Canada as well, the more radical communities are saying, well, actually, the insurance has always been our relationship to the land. So we're going back to that rather than going to the financial inclusion route.
Relationship to the land happens to be the subject of our next panel after we get to eat lunch. I just want to address you out there in the chat. There were two questions from the chat, but one was a questioning of abolition, which Femke ended up addressing, and the other was about the unpayable, which Max ended up addressing. So, and also some of my questions as well, ahead of me asking them. So thanks for being so foresighting. And thank you all. We have around an hour for lunch. It's being served by La Cucina Lamar outside. If you would like to purchase it, you can do that by getting a token at the front desk. And for the rest of you out there, bon appetit, and see you soon for Soil Times. Thanks.